professor in the political science department here at Wayne State. And I'm just delighted to introduce to you Professor Susan Herbst. Professor Herbst is currently the 15th president of the University of Connecticut, where she's been since December 2010. And she's the first female president of the university, so that's quite an accomplishment. Since her appointment, she has led multiple initiatives to strengthen teaching, research, and service at the university. Prior to her appointment at UConn, she has served as Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer at the University System of Georgia. She previously served as the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Temple University. Professor Herbst holds a BA in Political Science from Duke University, and her PhD is in Communication Theory and Research from the University of Southern California, Annenberg School of Communication in LA. She has spent 14 years at Northwestern, where she held a variety of positions, including Professor of Political Science and Chair of the department. Now, here's where things get more interesting for me as a researcher and someone who is looking forward to Professor Herbst's talk. When wearing her research hat, she's a scholar of public opinion, media, and American politics. She has written 4 books and many articles and book chapters in the areas of her research. She has also co-authored 3 popular textbooks on public opinion. Her most recent book, on which her talk is based, is called Group Democracy, Civility and Instability in American Politics. Professor Herbst's articles have been published in such outlets as Political Communication, Communication Research, Communication Theory, International Journal of Public Opinion, Research, and Journalism Quarterly. She's a co-editor of the University of Chicago Press series in American Politics. Finally, she has given numerous invited presentations, both within and outside of academia, and we're certainly very fortunate to have her speak to us about her recent work. Without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Herbst to Wayne State.
Thanks so much. Okay. Well, it's like a high school debate round now. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here to Wayne State. Was thrilled to be invited, and very grateful to especially Dr. Walter Edwards, there he is, for thinking of me and the Humanities Center. So I was glad to get the invitation. It's great to be in the David Adamany Library. David Adamany is somebody who was a mentor to me years ago when I was at Temple, and he always talked so lovingly about Wayne State, so I was curious to come. So apologies, I have to leave right after my talk, but if you need to find me, if you have ideas or questions, Dr. Edwards knows how to track me down, and happy to continue the discussion. So I've long been interested in these really kind of complex, sticky topics in democratic theory and democratic practice, and it's fun from a scholarly perspective, but it's a little frustrating too. And so one of the concepts that I've wrestled with over the years of my career is the public opinion, which is a phenomenon that gets increasingly more complex with every passing year and new technologies. And then I got interested in civility, which I put in that same category. Civility is crucial, it's central to American democratic process and practice. It is not a focus, of course, of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, because we didn't think of civility in the way we do now back then, but it's been around with us forever as a building block for democracy, and again, an aggravating and very slippery concept. So a lot of people ask me to define civility, which I slide around on in my book because it's too hard and it's very context dependent, and I don't really know that it furthers the dialogue too much anyway, but it would be nice if political scientists could agree on one. So I wrote a book about civility. This was several years ago because I saw its vital place in democratic practice, not because I foresaw that Nazis would march on the campus at the University of Virginia, or that Washington would look the way it does now, and that we'd see so much intolerance and so much racism, so much misogyny, in the social media, and just all around us. So the current climate is even more motivating for those of us who are trying to understand the lines between raucous public discourse and really dangerous, hateful political discourse. And you know, political hatred and intolerance have also been with us forever, but social media and the 24/7 news cycle highlight the dynamic in ways that we didn't expect, and it does so daily, hourly, depending on how much of a news junkie you are. So beyond democratic theory and political science, though, another reason why I wrote a book on civility was because of my experiences with undergraduate students over the decades, particularly undergraduates, graduate students less so. So when I wrote the book, it's about 7 years ago or so, I was working in Georgia in the university system there, and we were working a lot on free speech matters, and we decided to do a survey of about 2,000 students in the University of Georgia system across the state. And our goal was to make sure that students, undergraduate students in Georgia, felt comfortable in the classroom and on campus in terms of expressing their own political opinions. And what we found was really surprising to me, at least, which is that the faculty were not an issue at all, which is actually nice because I'm faculty too. Faculty were not a problem with students' comfort levels. No complaints there, no unusual complaints. But many students, I would say most students, expressed a kind of profound discomfort talking about politics, talking about race, talking about religion, sexuality, important social issues with each other. So students trouble talking to each other. They were worried about, as you can imagine, getting into a fight, being passionate where it's not quite welcome. They're afraid they're going to say something offensive to other people, and or just about getting upset themselves. So a lot of avoidance of these issues. And the most important takeaway is that students, they didn't feel great about political argument. They wanted to avoid it because it could lead to possibly some incivility, some disruption, some unhappiness. And so this is really troubling to somebody who's been a college professor my whole life. But it rang true. And I did, try to think back all those decades. If I was any good at making arguments in college, did I really seek out people who disagreed with me? Or did I tend to find friends and people to hang out with who weren't going to really change my mind, weren't going to challenge me? But taking it to a much grander level, does America know how to argue in a civil and productive fashion? And I think the answer now, even more than I wrote the book, is a resounding no. So hence our current political discourse, it's flip, it's hysterical, it's annoying, and it's downright dangerous at times, and I'm sure that all of you feel that as probably as we do back in the Northeast, back in Connecticut. There's, of course, incivility all around us in everyday life. So I just want to underscore that I'm not talking about lack of manners or general social rudeness, like when someone scoots in that parking spot you were waiting for, clearly, you had your signal on, or gives you the finger in traffic, which I get a fair amount, because my husband says because I'm a bad driver, but I just think it's incivility on the rise. But I'm not talking about those kind of social niceties or meanness. That's more about manners, and that's easier to work on. But less important than political civility and political discourse, how we tolerate each other, how we respect each other, and whether it goes anywhere productive in American politics and public policy. So let me talk about 3 aspects of political civility today. First, very briefly, civility in American history. Let's get a little more context to where we are here in 2017. Have we really hit bottom in terms of political civility? Where have we been as a nation to this point? Second area is, what is that balance between civility and incivility that we need to hit? Maybe some incivility is actually helpful. It's hard to think about this right now in this political environment. It's very hard. But maybe we need a tougher skin, a thicker skin. Third, I want to talk just very briefly about how we might boost civility through colleges, through schools and colleges, places that still have, I think, the most powerful effects on shaping us as citizens. We really do have a responsibility in higher education, whether we're students, we're faculty, staff, presidents, to try and solve some of these problems because we work in an environment with young people. So to history. It looks like there's a lot of incivility all around us. There is, but compared to what? You really do have to have some basis for comparison. And historians have tried to remind us with limited success that incivility has been a constant in American life, in American political life. We have always fought with each other, and it's always been pretty vicious. So in the 18th century, in the days of our founding, incivility was a constant. Some of it we thought was great, as we fought the British and all of its abuses to try to establish a free nation. But we often forget, or people don't know about, the duels. People had duels, ugly language, mudslinging that was not directed toward the crown or to Great Britain, but toward each other. So I was recently reading about Thomas Jefferson. He's the founder of the University of Virginia, and his battles with all the local, provincial politicians and ministers when he was building the university. And it was about as nasty as anything you'd see in Congress today. And our founding fathers were not models necessarily of dignity and civility. David McCullough, he's a great historian, writes he has a biography of John Adams, and he wrote, quote, Alexander Hamilton berated John Adams in nearly every possible way for his great intrinsic defects of character, his disgusting egoism, his weaknesses, vacillations, and his eccentric tendencies. Though Hamilton did not go so far as to call Adams insane, he cited his ungovernable temper as evidence of a man out of control. And this wasn't even close to how ugly it could get. So those things kind of ring familiar today, those sort of attacks on other political figures. And in the 19th century, there was not that much of an improvement. Far from it. Americans argued in ways that demeaned themselves, demeaned others. Often, as Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a great French scholar, visitor to the United States, he noted that one of the things that we did in the United States in the 19th century is that we silenced each other through speech, through intimidation. Even though he loved America in a lot of ways as he traveled around the East Coast and the Midwest, he was very conscious of our flaws, and especially the way Americans crushed minority opinion. And so it's from the 1830s, from Alexis de Tocqueville, that we get the phrase, tyranny of the majority. And he coined that phrase to describe what goes on in American communities, in American local communities. He looked at inequality and tension over slavery, prejudice in non-slave states, but he could not have seen, because he was traveling a little bit earlier than that, the incivility that America saw in the 1850s. So if I had to pick the worst time in American politics for civility, and the scariest, most brutal period in American history, it has to be the 1850s. As we approached the Civil War, a horrendous war that would divide a nation, change us forever, the 1850s were a time that we sustained a level of incivility that makes your cable news networks today, and even the most hateful tweeting and social media stuff, look like child's play. I mean, this was our low point in American history. And there's a really famous image from that era, from the 1850s, that I grabbed for my book cover, and it's a beating on the floor of the U.S. Senate. There's a senator from Massachusetts, Senator Sumner, and he was at his desk in the Senate signing some letters, and a congressman, Preston Brooks, he was from South Carolina, came over from the other side of Capitol Hill, from the House side to the Senate side. He stalked Sumner a little bit, and then he came into the Senate chamber and tried to kill him with a cane, and he nearly did. And so this is all on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So just to give you some sense of where we've been in American history. And that's not even the most, and there's plenty of examples of brutality in Congress on the floor. People pulled guns out on each other. There were some bench clearing brawls in Congress. So not quite there yet today, but I think that this was it was a low point in American history for a lot of reasons, but of course, emotion about slavery and abolition were central. So the 18th and 19th century, people really did try hard to kill each other openly because of offenses, feuds, insults, and the like, all within the realm of the American political sphere. Not much comfort here in the 21st century, but gives you some context. I don't mean to make incivility sound so ancient either. I mean, it rolled with us into the 20th century from the 19th century. Lynchings, for example, were a justified form of social and political action throughout the South until the 1960s. There was incivility and murder and hate on the ground, North and South, but also in our political discourse. And Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, you may know, he was labeled a socialist, a fascist. Reagan was a monster. George W. Bush was a village idiot, and so forth. For those of you who are my age, you remember some of that stuff. Incivility is really worrisome in a lot of ways, but of course has been made worse by the diffusion of broadcast media. Back in the mid-20th century, so this is the 1940s, there were these two great social scientists. They were both at Columbia, Robert Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld, and they coined a phrase for the problematic effects of the mass media on us, on citizens, and they called it the narcotizing dysfunction, which is a great thing to throw out at a cocktail party or in your dorm. The narcotizing dysfunction. So these two social scientists argued that when you have too much exposure to the mass media, and they were writing about radio because this is the 1940s, that too much exposure to the mass media can be debilitating to people. So listening to media, watching media, the constant political talk, they argued, does not lead people to action, it leads people to inaction. And the reason is that you start to replace doing with knowing. So instead of, because you consume all this media and you know a lot, you think you are acting when you're just really sitting on your couch. So here's a good example is when I lived in Chicago, we had this house where the other house was a mirror image of it right next door. So they could see into our kitchen, we could see into their kitchen. Nice people. Older people, and they were retired, and the wife, she mostly sat in the kitchen all day watching CNN. And I had little kids, so I wasn't watching a lot of CNN, but she was, and so one day we were talking out in the yard, and I said, "You're really interested in politics?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I am. I am a political animal." And I just thought that was a great example of the narcotizing dysfunction because she thought she was doing something when she was really just watching the news all day. So, perfect example of the narcotizing dysfunction when you replace doing with knowing. But I go a step further than this and argue that the kind of incivility that we see now on social media, on TV, the internet, is debilitating as well. It's true that some figures, take Rush Limbaugh or Jimmy Kimmel or Steve Colbert, whoever you want on either side of the aisle, some of them do actually encourage certain kinds of political action, voting, they're influential that way. But on the whole, I think the political chatter all around us is not inspiring. It doesn't inspire people left or right. It makes you, again, want to avoid politics in your daily life, even though you might be consuming it online pretty vociferously. But it makes you want to avoid direct talk about politics with people you know. And I include myself in this. I mean, I'm a lot more careful talking to neighbors, especially people who aren't close and friends about politics, because I don't really know what's going to come out. And then you think, well, you have to live near these people. And, it's worrisome. So it does, I think it makes a lot of people want to cower on their living room sofa or huddle close to their iPhone, be in a safe space, hope that you are yourself not a target for this kind of hatred. And this is something I've talked a lot with my students, with students on our campus, is they get very upset when they get into these kind of nasty fights over social media, oftentimes about social justice, about race, about gender. And my response is always, I'm upset for them. I'm upset because they're upset, but I also tell them to not do that. Don't go out there answering trolls or getting involved in it because it's not really productive kind of talk. But I realized that, it's part of our world too, it can't be avoided. So you got to find the right venues for that you'll learn something and hopefully debate some people, but not be involved in something that is truly upsetting and makes you not want to participate at all. So part 2, I said I would defend incivility a little bit, or at least see if we can find a balance between civility and incivility. So a few words on that. So the fact that incivility and this kind of political fighting that's really intense has been around with us in the United States forever, since the founding, through American history, it does make you wonder, even though this is hard to swallow, do people like it? Do they like it they like incivility? They certainly find incivility useful. It's functional for us. Civility and incivility, I'm not sure that they are states or moods of a nation, but more like strategic tools that people can use to get what they want. And the reason you see so much negative campaigning during an election is because the negativity, that incivility, it works. It gets out the vote, it raises money, it mobilizes voters. And the reason that a lot of the horrible talk show hosts that are around are on, and they're popular, is because people are tuning in. People are drawn to this. People vote with their feet when it comes to consumption of media. So, but I've argued that if we treat incivility, incivil talk, or civil talk as a strategic weapon, it does feel less painful. If rudeness or even trash talk is seen as talk, is seen as a rhetorical weapon in an arsenal, is it less disturbing? And is that a way we can conceptualize this instead of saying America is so horribly incivil and we need to get to some kind of mood state of civility? So it's back to that. Maybe we need to have a thicker skin when it comes to politics. And I know this sounds weird in 2017, but maybe we need to figure out how to stop being appalled and aghast all the time about especially when it comes out of Washington, and try to get past that feeling that we have of being, again, hurt, appalled, shocked. Can you believe he said that? So if it is free speech, why do we find it so problematic when we can use our own speech to defend ourselves, to defend our positions, to defend our fellow believers? At what point did we become so concerned with everybody's feelings and so fragile that free discourse really worries us and scares us? We have to reflect on whether we are too much of a culture of delicate flowers with shaky self-esteem, or are we a kind of a free, rough and tumble democracy that probably is more like what the founders had in mind, even if they didn't have social media. Going a bit, and I'm not sure how this whole American experiment would have turned out had they had social media. Going a little bit further though, and this is getting into one of the darker corners, I think, of American history and American democracy, is maybe incivility is attractive to us. It's always been part of the United States, it's always been part of this nation. There must be something functional about it. So I have a colleague at University of Texas, his name is Rod Hart, H-A-R-T, and he has a nice set of papers and talks where he outlines, he tries to get into why maybe incivility interests and attracts Americans. What is it about incivility and a lot of hateful talk many times that draws us in? So he's a pretty big list that he developed of why it might be functional for us. So here are a couple of points that he makes that I think are compelling. He says that for one thing, incivility draws us in because it's dramatic and it's engaging and it startles you, it wakes you up. It's good television, it's good radio. It keeps people's eyes glued to iPhone screens and computer screens. So incivility has a kind of a drama to it that's very interesting to people, and it shakes up your daily life in a way that's exciting somehow, cognitively. Second, he says incivility is dialectical usually, and so what he means by that is that incivility is usually at least it's the way it's done in the United States here, it's a two-sided argument. Incivility tends to be part of two sides. The world is much muddier than that, much more complicated than that, but incivility sets up two parties against each other in a kind of a simplistic way that makes it easier for us to understand in a very complex, messy, chaotic world. So it's kind of helpful for the brain in that, and therefore attractive to us in trying to figure out the world. So incivility, it's dramatic, it's engaging, it's two-sided, it's dialectical, and then Rod argues too, and I think this is a really powerful argument, is that incivility, I know this sounds weird, is social. It connects us to maybe often repulsive, sometimes inspiring ideas and people. So incivility it kind of reminds you that you live in a social world with a lot of other people, and we are social beings. So in a way he's saying that people, maybe they even like incivility because at least it's engaging and it's social more than the kind of isolation you find when there's no political debate at all, or it's just nice, friendly, civil debate. It really, again, is not that engaging. So it's a lot to ponder, especially in these days in 2017, where it seems like we spend a lot of time, most of our time, when we talk about politics, with the, oh my God, what is happening? Is this rock bottom? Could he say anything worse? So forth. What is it about incivility that keeps drawing us back? Because 2017 isn't the first year we've seen this. We've had it around for a while, centuries in fact. So last part of my talk is I have some ideas, they're not great, about ways to reduce incivility, and it's something that I think we all have to work on as a nation, but could make incivility a little less intolerable, and even give us practice in dealing with incivility. So what can we do? So in my book I have a few ideas. I don't think they're developed nearly enough, but here are some things that I threw out there just as an educator that you can give some thought to. First is to teach argument. So I am a former high school debater. Maybe that was a high tone in my life. I don't know, it was a lot of fun. Engaging, dialectical, all that stuff. But teach argument. So in classrooms, as a required class, so I'm not talking about public speaking, and a lot of universities, maybe even this one, have some public speaking requirements, but I'm talking about an actual required course or more in argument. Could be done, the nice thing about K to 12 is that you can make students do stuff in a way you can't in colleges and universities. So argument could be taught as early as elementary and middle school. And there are so many great teachers out there in the world who have put stuff on the internet, have put curricula on the internet for how to teach even very young kids, elementary school, middle school, certainly high school, how to argue and how to do it well. So a lot of resources out there, we just, I think, don't use them, except for some visionary teachers in some places. And maybe even college presidents should be a little more heavy-handed in this and try to work on mandated courses on argument. Again, not public speaking, because public speaking is not argument necessarily. Second, and this is something that you, especially young people here, know a lot more than I do, is how to use technology to not only teach argument in the classroom, but also outside the classroom, in online debates, video debates, critiquing them. One of the good things I think about millennials and this generation of young people is that you guys seem to have no problem with self-revelation. It's a little, for people my age, it's a little weird what people your age would be willing to put on the internet, but it's probably good in that there is a kind of openness, and maybe this kind of saying anything, willing to put your privacy at risk, that has something to do with fostering more constructive political debate on the internet. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. I'm not on Facebook, and I know that sounds very dinosaur-like, but I'm like trying to reduce my screen time, not increase it. And from what I gather from people though who are on Facebook, it's been really damaged by the run-up, the 2016 election and then the Trump presidency, where there's so much political screed, so many political screeds on there, but it's not really turned into dialogue in the way that people had hoped when Facebook came about to start with. We really, it's one thing to talk, it's one thing to debate. The other side of this is you got to learn to listen better. And we all know that, and our parents told us that, and preachers and teachers, and everybody said listening is a critical skill. But we're pretty bad at it in the United States. And there's this one really terrific example of it that I like. It's on National Public Radio, and it's called, they do it every Friday. It's kind of a listening post thing. Anybody know the name of that? What's it called? I don't know, it's people telling their stories, kind of oral. StoryCorps, yeah. So people are taped in a booth telling each other stories about their lives, and sometimes it's political, a lot of times it's very personal, but it's an example of National Public Radio, at least, trying to teach us how to settle down, try to pay attention, try to really listen to another person. We've got obviously a long way to go on that, but it is, it's the other side of argumentation. So just in closing, because I'd love to hear your comments, one of the things that we really need to do is to stop blaming media. A lot of people want to turn to media as inciting incivility, as not making things any better, but I actually think that, putting aside some flamboyant talk show hosts and all, the American news media has not been the problem particularly. They're a reflection of who we are. And if we hold, mirror up to ourselves as citizens and figure out, why we are attracted to incivil discourse, how we are, again, at making arguments, at listening, if we start to examine ourselves on those dimensions, then I think we'll stop talking about what this or that media figure is doing, or honestly, what this or that politician or even president is doing. And these politicians, they got elected by people, and you've heard that all year long since the 2016 election. We have an unusual president, and there's no question about that. But certainly a duly elected president. And is it about him? Is it about people in Washington, or is it about us? And that's, I think, the much harder set of questions to ask. One of the things students mentioned in all the surveying I've done of them with undergraduates is that it's very hard for them to get passionate about politics and not, again, lose their temper or stop listening to people. So, for students here today, I think that's something that, you have to work on your whole life, and I'm not sure I'm so great at it either, is how to feel passionately, how to argue passionately, but also still, try to listen to people as hard as that may be, and as upsetting as that may be, and again, often difficult to turn on the other network or the other side and take a listen to that. It's hard many times, but it will make you better at arguing, and I think make you a better listener when you do confront that or think about confronting that in your daily life, whether that's inside the classroom or outside the classroom. So that's what I had to say. I would love to hear your thoughts about civility, about incivility, since I'm a political scientist, I have no problem talking about anything related to the current political culture. And thanks again, Walter, and everybody for inviting me here. So questions? There's got to be something.
What do you think about this idea of place being as a factor in civil versus incivil dialogue conversation?
A place.
Like place,
Yeah.
say like the Detroit riverfront or like
Yeah.
parks and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important part of this. So, and there have been some great scholarly works on this. Is one of the problems in the United States is the disappearance of space and place where you're supposed to go to have political discussion. So we have our homes, you have your apartments, you have your dorms, you have your workplace, you have your school place, and those are all places that are pretty highly regulated. or completely not. I mean, in your home, but it's just, it's just you and your friends or your family. And then those other places are pretty structured and pretty formal. And not having a lot of great public space has been a problem in fostering political discourse. So in the United States, in those centuries I talked about, in the 18th century and the 19th century, there were more of those public spaces. I mean, back in the 19th century, most people, newspapers were not price free to buy. Taverns and bars and coffee houses bought newspapers, and then people would go to those places to read them and to talk about them. And so that kind of third place that people dream of in terms of political discourse, we have trouble with this. Architects, social planners, they are trying. I don't know if Detroit is a place like this where they're trying to build out public space for people to gather. But the question is too, what do you do when you get there? So I go like in New York City, so we're near New York City, so I'm there a lot, and there's this beautiful public park that was built along old rail lines all along the Hudson River called the High Line. If you go to New York, it's a great place to go. I mean, that is built out for public space discussion, walking, playing, performance, and mostly you see people there hanging out, getting sun on their iPhones. So, you can create the place, you can create the space, but again, do people have it in them, and is the culture such that they're going to use it in the extremely visionary ways that architects and social planners have wanted, had hoped of? Yeah?
How do you deal with the question of power, so that we may listen, but if I have more access to institutions, to actors within the institution, why do I have to listen if I have more power than the other person? So how do we address that question? It comes to power relations. So two people come in a space and talk. Mm-hmm. A has more power than B. Mm-hmm. B knows A has more power than that. So how do you deal with this question of the power relations that come into being? I can be civil.
Sure.
Because I made more power than you. So how do you deal with this question of power relations?
It's absolutely crucial to this, so it's a great question. But I just say that it's where the social media have potential to help us. And it hasn't panned out that way in the way it should. I mean, absolutely. We'll take the Bernie Sanders movement. That is, one could argue that, and it is true by the kind of the demographics of the people who support them, a lot of young people. I mean, our campus was certainly, very, very heavily in the primaries for Sanders. You can argue that was a movement or a demographic of young people without power in the institutional sense. And, and look what they were able to do. I mean, they were able to really give Hillary Clinton a run for money. Move On I'm sorry, Black Lives Matter. Move On first, then Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's a movement too, not of entitled people with a lot of institutional power or control. Or old-fashioned organizing and then newfangled organizing through the internet. So we have a lot of opportunities. They'll never be as great as being, President of the United States or a leader of the House or Senate. Those are powerful positions, or corporate leadership that are obviously entirely different. But I think there's a lot of hope that for expression, even within the current power dynamics, and in big part due to technology.
Yes, thank you. I really did like your concept about teaching a course in argument. I think it has a lot of merit, but I have a question. Would the premise be in that course and the objectives or outcome to teach the management of affective responses or passion, and or to help individuals listen to what I would call a truth claim? And what would be the outcome in terms of the argument? Does it change the position of both people who are in that position?
Now, that's a great question. I wouldn't know how to do the latter. So the idea is that you teach people the more formal parts of argumentation. Like when you make an argument, you have to have evidence, and the evidence has to be defensive. You're going to be able to have good evidence that's defensible. You have to answer the other people's argument, not just go your own way and act like it didn't exist. But your point, I think, is great, is that A lot of this is emotional. A lot of this is about how to deal with your passions while you're making these arguments. So I think the ideal course would be designed for the rest of us to teach. The best course would be designed by somebody who understands the more therapeutic, psychological side of this, in addition to my side is more of a, political science, debate side of this. So I think they're critical elements.
The two great civic Republican American inventions in the early 19th century were the public park and public education. Right? And the public park was invented to be a place to teach civility, not different than the third place, not for political argument, the argument was frowned on, but for people to bond as a community. And the same was true of public education. I too love the idea of right. But you're a university president, and the question, talk about incivility, good or ill, although actually it's not much of it depressing, right? The 1850s was our worst decade, but we know where that went, right?
That did not end well.
But talk about incivility is talk about the symptom and not the problem. And the problem, you alluded to the problem at various points, the democratizing dysfunction, consumer society, the disaggregating effects of social media, etc. But without antidotes of social institutions that are designed to educate people to be different, to be civil, I think in a broader sense, there's no hope, right? But instead what's happening at the university is the corporatization, right, and the neoliberalization of it. And if I wanted to teach a course on argument here, I'd first have to break it down into bite-sized learning outcomes and get it through by between teaching and learning, right? If I said I was teaching citizenship, I am certain that would be sent back to me as not meeting the standard, right? So that's where our problems are, or that's where we can do something about our problems. You particularly, but you're uniquely situated. So what would you do at the university level, right? Instead of people borrowing to buy an education is for consumer items, and they could then get a career, which is how we think about education. How could we change education? More the image of Jefferson and the civic Republicans of the early 19th century.
Well, I guess I've been lucky. I'm not sure how the curriculum, how you guys develop it here and how it works here, but I think I've been lucky at the places I have been or have taught. It wasn't that much of a hurdle to get this kind of thing done as part of a gen ed.
It didn't used to be anywhere else either.
But I mean, the faculty must. Okay, I don't want to get into your politics here, but I mean, most places the faculty do control the curriculum. I mean, if you can really get your colleagues together across fields and decide that, okay, maybe you do have to use the learning outcomes. But
if I may, these are responsive to federal regulations. These are required by the bond administration for federal funds. Right? That's why we have this regulation. It's not just unique to Wayne, it's actually only
I don't know, again, it's unfamiliar to me because the places I've been at have had pretty strong liberal arts curriculum where there's room for this. Where, certainly there's regulation, but there's room to do this, I think, if we really want to.
I didn't know that.
But your points are well taken too. I think that if we're going to be serious about this in education, which is what we do, I mean, we can't help what goes on in families, churches, other important institutions, but here we've got to have the will for it, and then I think, anything's possible, but it's going to be back to us.
Speaking of corporatization and public forums like the parks, in the last 10 years here in Detroit, corporations have taken over all the downtown public parks. And if you're of the opinion that the first thing tyrants do is shut down the public forums, historically this is accurate, then if you're of the opinion that we are controlled, most all facets of our society are controlled by a modern tyranny, and they set the tone, how can the people how can the people be civil to one another when all the power structures are causing us to be incivil to one another?
Well, I don't know, I mean, I stayed downtown last night, so I got to see some of your public space that you're talking about. I didn't see any, you know, like corporate compliance officers walking around there trying to crush anybody's free speech. You know, like I think that...
All the security guards in the parks are corporate employees.
Okay, so you get some work to do here in your Detroit public spaces. Now, it's just well taken. If they're that regulated because they were built, you know, by then refurbished as part of the resurgence of
And
this.
now upkept on corporate money.
Interesting. Well, you talking one more?
That's actually up to you. It's already, I think, 1:35.
Okay, maybe one more quick one.
Just one more quick question. How about you, sir?
Yes, absolutely. You were talking about how social media has become a part of the political scene, especially recently in the highlight of Twitter, where President Obama began interacting with his constituents on Twitter, and now essentially President Trump doesn't enforce his Twitter account. How do you were talking about the dysfunction of media causing people to know rather than act, but now more than ever, with the advent of the internet, it's easy essentially for people to get their voice out there, become a part of the media as much of a listener. Do you think that will reduce the effects of this dysfunction, or actually enhance it as people's voices are put out there but ignored?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's we're so deep in it now. Now we have to make it work for us. You know, it's you know, there's no pulling back from the fact that Twitter exists, and everybody from the President of the United States on down has access to this stuff. A lot of it is about how we use it, how we talk about it. I hear a lot of politicians in the media say, well, if he would just stop tweeting, then like this whole thing would settle down, and you know, we could have some kind of normal political discourse again. That's a kind of engine for disruption, and I don't think it's true. I think if he weren't tweeting, it would be some other means of communication. So I think it's going to be back to who we are, and you know what we think this democracy needs to be. And how to use technology, not be technological determinists, which is a really easy thing we fall into. It's like TV caused this, the internet caused this, Twitter caused this, when you know these are things we built, that we use, that we like, that we do, that we control. So, well, thanks everybody again for having me.